keep your applause going. Make it big and loud and loving for Kara Foran.
So when I finally made it to DC at age 18 after many, many years of purgatory in Ohio, it was like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when everything goes from black and white to Technicolor, you know? My freshman year at GW was the best year of my life, maybe so far. I saw Nirvana play on their final tour, and I smoked clove cigarettes in DuPont Circle at midnight, and I learned that I'd been being oppressed by the patriarchy my whole life when I was supposed to be mad about it, and I never even knew. And I remember I woke up thinking every day, like, thank God I am finally where I'm supposed to be among my people. This is how my life is supposed to go. So you can imagine that when my parents told me over spring break that there was no more money for school and I was gonna have to go home, I was a little bit upset. And I spent the next year back in Ohio, which should have been my sophomore year in DC, working at Walmart, taking classes at the local community college, and trying to come to terms with a life that no longer contained Thai food or lattes. My mom suggested that I deal with it by thinking of my time in DC as a year abroad. And I thought, well, maybe that's how I should think about it, you know? Maybe that's just how this goes. But through some fancy financial aid wrangling, I made it back to DC in time for what would have been my junior year, and I came back triumphant, right? Like someone who deserved a ticker tape parade for like conquering some country overseas. But a year's a long time in college, and a lot had changed. My friends had moved on, I was behind academically, and most of all, I was like terrifically, absurdly poor. And after a couple years of struggle, I ended up dropping out, just as the friends I had started with were moving to become dot-com billionaires and stuff. I just needed a break and to earn some money and stop eating ramen noodles for a hot minute, and I got a job waiting tables at a now-defunct Irish bar in Woodley Park called Murphy's. What? Right. And to understand how happy I was at Murphy's, you have to know that my dad was a career bartender and my stepdad was a career alcoholic. So between the two of them, I spent more time in bars before I turned 13 than most people do before they turn 30. And I just knew who I was there. I knew how to be. And in fact, I liked it so much that after I'd been there for a few months, I started to kind of forget about school and all the struggle I'd gone through there and think, well, maybe this is who I'm supposed to be. Maybe this is the life I'm supposed to have. And so it was one hot, sticky August night. I found myself at this after-hours club in Cleveland Park called Club Soda. Dirty people, you know what it is. And Club Soda was disgusting. It is dark and dirty and full of roaches, and to get in, you had to like lurk across the street until the coast was clear and dive through a window. But I'm there, it's like 4 o'clock in the morning. I've been to, about 10 bars already, and I'm talking to this super hot Irish guy that I had been lusting after for a while. He was a singer in some of the bars that I hung out in, and he had those 90s white boy dreads. And Club Soda was starting to wind down. He was like, said he knew about another place that we could go. And I was like, you know what? Well, for one thing, I'm kind of an accent whore. And for another thing, I'd had lots and lots to drink. So I was like, it seems like a great idea. I should definitely get in your car with you and not tell anyone where I'm going and just roll the dice. And so I did. And I started to regret my decision pretty much instantly when I got into his car because, number one, he was wasted. And number two, he took me out of Cleveland Park and way across town into what was, at the time, a very shady part of Shaw. And I became even more alarmed when we arrived at our destination, and it was not actually another after-hours bar, but a row house. And not just a row house, but a row house that was like dark and dirty and cramped, and as my eyes adjusted to the light, it was also full of people doing massive amounts of drugs. Like cutting lines on the table, and money was changing hands, and people had guns that you could visibly see. And as I looked around and started to sort of take all that in, I noticed that there were also very, very few women there. And of the women who were there, I was the only one with clothing that adequately covered her vagina. That was the first time I'd ever seen pimps and prostitutes, but it turns out that, like pornography, you do know it when you see it. And so I'm in this place, and I'm like rapidly sobering up and regretting a lot of life decisions I've made that have brought me to this point. And, Finn McDread goes to get us a beer, and he comes back and he hands it to me. And I took it from him and I was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much, really appreciate that. But all of a sudden, I'm just exhausted. And I think I'm just gonna catch a cab and go home, thanks for the ride, I'll see you later. And he cocked his dreads at me, and he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, I don't think it's the kind of neighborhood where you want to be walking around looking for a cab by yourself this time of night. It's not really safe, so why don't you sit tight and I'll see you home in the morning. Was that Lucky Charms guy? Yeah. And this was 1997-ish, so there was no such thing as cell phones that I knew of, and I really had no choice but to wait for him, and so I did. And I sat there in a state of such panic and anxiety. I felt like a bird of prey must feel, where every little line is perfectly delineated and everything is crystal clear. And I kept my eyes glued to that door because I really didn't want to make eye contact with anyone. I was afraid that either I'd be co-opted into a life of prostitution or forced to do drugs. And I really didn't want to do either one of those things. And I had a lot of time to think about how I'd gotten to this place in my life. I was the first person in my family to go to college, the only one to ever leave town, and now here I was, and I was pretty sure a massacre was gonna break out any minute, and my mom was gonna get the most bewildering phone call of her life and find out that her child, her pride and joy, had died in a crack house full of whores in a bad part of town in the middle of the night. And sure, my life had gone off track, but had it gone that far off track? So I didn't die, spoiler. And I would like to say that what I did was immediately quit my job at Murphy's and stop taking all the shift drinks that were offered to me and go back to school and get my life back on track. But of course, it doesn't quite work like that. But I did eventually become a productive member of society who tells story at the Moth, so thanks.